They taught us to speak the words before our tongues could form the shapes of them. The vow was practiced like a wound, pressed into the flesh of memory until it scarred. In the cradle of the hab block, an attendant with a voice like a ledger recited the litany, and my mother's hands forced my fingers to the iron rim of the bowl. Around us, the chapel's stone drank the sound, 1,000 tiny echoes that made the syllables feel inevitable, as if the hall itself had always been waiting for them. It was not a promise. It was an instruction to serve, to obey, to yield the last beat of your heart when called upon by an emblem, a trumpet, a command. The architecture of that lesson was everywhere. Shrines carved into manufactorum walls, aquilas stamped into the lids of feed chests, the canted statues of saints with their eyes ground to blind stone so that only posture mattered. Even the light was measured, pale, capped by soot, forcing faces into relief so that devotion could be read like print. We learned to read one another in silhouette, the exact angle of a bowed head, the minor tremor in a clenched fist, the clockwork timing of an answered prayer. Life here was a performance calibrated for survival. The oath itself was brief. It fit on a breath. It fit on a scar. For the Emperor I live and die. Each time we said it, our voices lowered a degree, reverent, trained, efficient. It was less a personal vow than a civic function, like paying a tax or filing a ration slip. Men who failed to enunciate with the right cadence were directed into private rooms where patience replaced fire. The mechanism of compliance does not need spectacle, it requires only repetition. From the first day in the militia, they make you practice dying. Training is not only about marksmanship or bayonet drills, it is about familiarity with absence. We are drilled to imagine the last sight, the flicker of flame from a las gun, the hiss of a shell, the hush that follows a sergeant's final order. Every exercise ends with the hymn, the vox chant swelling until it flattens thought into rhythm. In that flattening, dying is rebranded as meaning. One learns to equate the cessation of breath with the completion of purpose. Death becomes the ultimate punctuation across the Imperium. The bells mark it, a measured toll for a foot soldier, a triple clang for an officer, a silence so precise for a sister of the ecclesiarchy that even wind seems ashamed to stir. The bell's arithmetic organizes grief into doctrine. Mourning is not a private incision here. It is public ledger. Names entered, rites performed, memorial candles burned until the smoke itself writes the next chapter of obedience. They teach you to hear the bell and think not of loss but of contribution. And still I wondered, not loudly at first, not in any way that would attract a censor or a sergeant with a pen. The thought came like a gull's shadow crossing a plaza, slight, accidental. I was 13 in the drill yard when it rose, a thing as simple as breath between beatings of a war drum. What if I do not want to die? It was a grain of stone lodged under the tongue. Absurd, unbearable, impossible. The shadow passed and I swallowed the question down with a mouth full of him. I spat the sound of it out in the next litany, and the taste of the question burned on my palate like bad oil. I learned then the difference between thought and crime. In the Imperium, to think is not simply to be wrong, it is to become visible. The oath wraps around a man like a chain because it replaces argument with ritual. Ritual isolates, ritual simplifies. It turns a complex life, composed of hands that gave bread, whispers shared in the dark, the private geometry of an old man's grief, into a single shape that can be measured under inspection. To refuse is to place a foreign gear into the machine. The machine does not seize immediately, it catalogs, it watches. They call the practice of watching vigilance. The commissars call it purity, the priests call it faith. To those who read orders, dissent is not a human failing but a failure in the indexing of souls. So the system arranges itself not only to punish overt betrayal, but to root and remove any deviation before it becomes spectacular. It takes the small things first, a pause in prayer, a gaze that lingers too long on the manufactorum horizon, a hand that hesitates over a ration token. Each small fissure places you on a map. We were taught paradox as theology. Dying willingly for the Emperor is life, and to live by your own measure is the worst of crimes. The logic chains itself, and the logic never rests. A man who yields himself in service receives the adulation of plates and ribbons. A man who keeps breath receives suspicion as a fever. Observers begin to assign meaning to the most accidental of human acts. Survival becomes a contaminant, not because the state desires death, but because the state cannot allow an alternative narrative to survive. In the mess hall, I watched men swear in unison that surrender was sacred. They raised their spoons, and the vox chant stitched the words to their lips. Around us, the hab block hummed with the mundane noises of life. A child's cough, the grinding of an auger, the metallic laugh of a steam valve. But beneath those sounds ran a quieter current, the unspoken measurement of how tightly a man gripped his spoon, whether his eyes lifted when the hymn reached its apex. We measure each other now, in 1,000 small ways, because the oath has taught us to distrust the living who do not show their readiness to die. There is a peculiar violence in the normalization of death. It steals from people their private reasons to live, the smell of baking bread, the tenderness of a sister's hand, the particular timbre of a friend's laugh. Instead, those things are weighed and registered. Sentiments are cataloged as possible threats. A man who once loved becomes a potential index entry. Love itself risks being read as a defect. The culture of sacrifice eats tenderness because tenderness might breed attachments that contradict the sacrifice demanded of us. I remember my father's hands as he showed me how to knot the scarf that citizens wear beneath the chest plate. There was callus on the thumb where he had once repaired a generator with his bare skin. He hummed a hymn as his fingers worked, and I asked, absurdly, if he would be proud should he die in service. He did not answer then. He kept nodding. Later, when he thought I was asleep, he traced the scar that ran along his forearm, and I heard the thin sound of a man measuring himself against a horizon he could not change. His life did not answer me. It demonstrated silence. It is an old cruelty, institutionalized. The system does not need to shout its cruelty. It shapes it into form. Worship replaces wonder. Martyrdom becomes a template for being. The oath that binds us is like cold iron. Once fastened, its edges are felt in every ordinary movement. Your gait, your eyes, the way you say the creed, each element becomes a sign of compliance or a mark of deviation. The imperative to die is taught alongside the grammar of daily life, and so questioning feels like mispronouncing a sacred syllable. I learned to keep the question inside, folded small against the lining of my mind. I learned to speak the words with the right cadence, to bow at the right angle, to let the hymn wash over me until doubt felt faint as a memory. I practiced the art of not being remarkable. There is a certain skill in performing normality when normality itself is a political act. You can survive by becoming precisely what the designers of the oath expect you to be: obedient, uncurious, and ready. But some things do not die easily. The refusal is not always seismic. Often it is a slow corrosion, a single grain of salt dropped into the gears, an irritation that will not be turned away. It gnaws in quiet places, in the half-light before roll call, in the clench of a hand that will not loosen on a weapon, in the way a man lingers at a window watching the smoke of other worlds without the practiced acceptance of sacrifice. I have tried to believe that the oath would settle the question. I have tried to let the ritual wash me clean. I have bowed until my knees ached, and the vox chant has entered my bones like a slow storm. Yet tonight, in the bitter small hours when the hab block breathes shallow and the bell's echo dies away, I find that the question returns, clear as frost on the glass. I did not wish to die for the Emperor. They had called the movement a routine advance, language meant to make the slaughter sound ordinary. We were to take the rise, sweep the ruined factory, and cut the enemy's line of fire. The officer's words were crisp, timed with the cadence of the rifles being readied. 10 counts, move, secure, hold. He held the command like a hinge, and we were meant to swing through it. The day smelled of copper and diesel and the old iron suite of scorched wiring. Sky was a bruise, thick with smoke from shells that had come and gone before we reached the parapet. Crates of ordnance spat the thud of falling shells into the distance. A distant walker's footfall made the ground tremble beneath our boots. We leaned into the earth, faces slick with the same dust that had coated the engine works a month ago. A man laughed somewhere, a sound too bright and brief, and then the vox tree at the sergeant's shoulder crackled, the order toggling into public hearing. Advance on my mark. I remember the sensation before the motion, a hollowing in the middle of my chest, as if some careful surgeon had removed the place where courage should live and left an operation scar to ache in the cold. My hands were steady, trained to load, to set bayonet, to obey. My legs obeyed the drills of 1,000 rehearsals, but when the signal snapped through the air, my feet did not move. They remained planted as if rooted into some old bone beneath the sod. For a heartbeat, I thought this was simple cowardice, a shameful, immediate thing I could scrub away with the next order. But cowardice implies a choice. What held me was not fear in its ordinary form. It was an absence of the willingness the Imperium expects. It was a fissure in composed action, a hesitation that did not taste of hesitation but of refusal, tiny and absolute. Around me, the line surged. Shoulder to shoulder, men vaulted the lip of the trench. A dozen boots hammered into the mud like small meteors. Rifles flared, lighting faces in red. The world grew a series of arcs, tracer lines knitting the distance into geometry, the enemy positions marked by the orange bloom of their return. I watched them go as if observing a ritual from the outside, a motion that belonged to others, not to me. The sound was immediate, simultaneous, a chorus of shouts, the ripping whisper of La's fire, the sick thud of impact against flesh and plating. They fell quickly. It was not cinematic, it was mechanical. One man whom I'd shared bread with last watch went high and fell with half the helmet blasted away, the comm seal smoking on his neck. Another was severed where he'd crouched into the blast, his rifle clattering like a broken twig down the slope. Burnt ozone stung my nostrils, the air filled with 1,000 fragments, metal, voice, bone. I inched forward then, not because my feet obeyed, but because something in me could not let the tableau stand. I staggered along the trench mouth and slid down onto the slope. Around me, the survivors curled into hollows they had dug with their bodies. A corporal barked for medics and for a casualty report, his voice rough as wire, and a priest, a field chaplain, his face wrapped in a soot-stained scarf, moved like a shadow among the broken. They looked at me. It is a peculiar thing, the intensity of a man's stare when life hinges on another's motion. It reads like an interrogative. It has a vocabulary made of accusation. Why did you not go? Do you think that your skin is worth more than mine? Have you measured your breath against the cost of the rest? Eyes catalogued me, a ledger of reproach. One voice rose from the heap of fallen and damaged, half prayer, half plea. Men called names, counted mates still breathing. The priest began his old cadence, a low mutter to smother panic into doctrine, to fold fear into ritual and present it as piety. I had heard such words before in halls of wood and stone. There they had steadied me. Now, as the priest moved among the wounded, his mutter thinned at my presence. He found me with his glance the way a surgeon finds a clean incision, and his mouth stalled. I felt that pause like a blade being set against my throat. Guilt arrived like a physical thing, cold damp in my throat, the metallic tang of iron with the sourness of shame. My hands shook not from recoil but from some inner indictment. I had, in a moment that might have been measured in heartbeats, chosen staying over giving. That heterodox economy, to keep breath where others were requited of it, carried within it a gravity. The surviving men who turned toward me did so with faces altered. Their murmurs were clinical now. A man's simple injury was a data point. I heard one say quietly, he lingered. He did not run. The words were a soft instrument. Later, when the medics had sealed wounds and the sergeant recorded names on a tablet with the calm of someone erasing a stain, the whispers grew louder. Not loud in volume. The habit of war muffles everything, but loud in implication. A repairman who had been down the line with me slid a quick, measured glance across to a mate, and the look in his eyes spoke of contingency. If delay spreads, will I be the one left? The logic of the field is brutal and efficient. Hesitation is weakness, and weakness propagates. I tried to explain. I mouthed the shape of excuses: shell shock, a slip of footing, a misheard order. Excuses are tools with their own rhythm. If delivered in the right tempo, they soothe. If offered in the wrong tone, they incite. No sooner had I offered a thin, practiced phrase than I saw the way its edges were received. My words were a patch over a deeper chafe. The men around me had not come to demand my motive exactly. They were making an inventory of risk. To be alive where others had died was to become a potential hazard in the calculus of survival. The priest, who had bound 2 shoulders and blessed a jawless face minutes earlier, stood opposite me now, hands on his censer. His gaze traveled along the seams of my uniform as if reading a manifest. He did not ask why I had not moved. He asked the manner of my breath as if testing whether it weighed like courage. A question like that is not meant for answer. It is meant to measure. Something shifted in the line after that. Men who had been comrades pulled away with an architecture of distance. A shared cigarette was withheld. A ration bar passed with a glance that curated conversation. Where hearts had beaten in rhythm, there was now a metronome of calculation. Silence became its own sanction. The communal fabric frayed into threads that were individually measured for tensile strength. Nightfall offered no solace. The sheltering darkness of the limbic night did not hide who I had become. If anything, shadows defined the shape of others' avoidance. Around the brazier men spoke in lower tones, their stories orbiting the motion of that day. Who ran, who fell, who finished the task. The recounting was not merely memory. It was a ritual to reassert the narrative that the machine requires. To normalize sacrifice is to preserve its power. When a recruit from the next sector asked me, with naive bluntness, whether I had felt fear, I said yes. My answer sounded honest, but it was also a tactical utterance. The admission of fear can be turned into penance. People took my confession and folded it. They filed it mentally. The field has room for contrition that reassimilates the suspect to the machine. Repentance is a currency. Still, the eyes never lost their attention. A week passed and the injury lists kept arriving at the office. A scrubbed icon by my name, then another line, noted for review. The sergeant moved through our numbers with the practiced impartiality of one who knows that one weak cog sends a tremor through the entire engine. Men who once cracked jokes at my expense now offered only stiff nods of courtesy, the smallest piece of social etiquette that maintained functioning without intimacy. I began to watch myself the way others did. I counted the micro gestures of my own hands. I timed the length of my prayer when the priest came through the quarters. I rehearsed the exact cadence of the pledge I had been drilled to make, not for faith, but as armor. Each performance pushed away suspicion for an hour, maybe 2, until the next check. That living by measure was a new kind of life, one ruled by a constant small audit. But the most damning thing was not the street murmurs, nor the ledger marks scratched by clerks. It was the way the priest's voice had quavered when he saw me. That tiny falter was more telling than any accusation made aloud. The clerical pause reached into me and left a wordless verdict. They know. They do not need to shout anymore. The enforcement of belief has grown subtle, an architecture of routine and record that turns devotion into data. When the sermons sharpened, it was not in volume but in resolution. The priest's cadence changed from balm to scalpel, shorter pauses, clearer enunciation, each liturgical clause delivered with a timing so exact it might have been cut by a machine. Vox Towers carried those voices not as consolation, but as calibration. Every sermon was piped into quarters, refineries, the yards, and played back at set intervals until its phrasing lodged in the ears as an instruction rather than an idea. The oaths were replayed until there was no space for thought between them. At first, I thought that repetition would soothe. The human mind can be trained like muscle, but there is a difference between training and measurement. The sermons became tests. How a man answered, how long he lingered on the final intonation, whether his breath aligned with the beat of the litany. Each public prayer had an invisible rubric. The Vox recordings did not simply teach the creed. They supplied a standard against which hushed deviations could be compared. A man who mouthed the words out of time could be spotted, not by a glance, but by a recorder that found a millisecond's variance and placed it in a ledger. Where once confession created absolution, now it creates evidence. Confessions used to be private communion, two guilty souls bending in the dark so that sin might be carried away. Here, the confessional became an array of archival tools. Scribes sit in the shadowed alcoves not merely to copy absolutions but to index them. Their quills scratch with the nervous precision of a surgeon's instrument, and the ink that falls becomes two things at once, scripture and record. I learned this the hard way. A whispered admission of doubt, intended as a catharsis, is now transmuted into a permanent line on a file. The sanctified ledger holds your breath and keeps it. The machinery is both metal and ritual. Servoskulls drift through the habs in amiable arcs, their lenses rosined against dust, their optic facets recording with indifferent appetite. Autoquills in chapel wings dutifully transcribe sermons and murmurs into data cassettes that are then fed into warm, humming cogitators. Priests wield censers that carry not only incense but micro-readers, tiny filaments that register particle movement and thus attendance. Even the way bread is distributed has been folded into surveillance. Rations logged to biometric stamps, the precise time of consumption noted, patterns algorithmically compared to templates of loyalty. Every act becomes an entry, every absence a missing datum. The social aspect of that machinery is crueler still. Old guards, men who once clapped you on the shoulder, learn to read the logs. They no longer ask about your night's work with casual interest. They consult the ledger with a discreet thumb and say, "You were late," as if reading a weather report. A half-second lag in prayer is an item, a glance in the wrong direction is catalogued. The Commissar's phrase, "Purity is our shield," has become an operation manual for these men. They perform vigilance the way they perform drills, without malice, with a professionalism that makes it more terrible. My food became smaller, not because the kitchen meant me harm. There were ration codes and supply shortages, but because somebody adjusted the allocation. Perhaps a foreman who had been friendly before found my name on a slip and made a choice, to share less rather than risk storytelling that might implicate him. Or perhaps some anonymous clerk noticed the minute during the hymn when I had faltered and altered my allotment as a precautionary reallocation. The result was the same. My guts clenched with cold hunger at odd hours. The bunk felt colder too. Warders rearranged watch assignments so that my shifts overlapped with men who looked at me as if I were an experiment under observation. Silence itself turned forensic. Where silence had once been rest, now it spoke. A gap in the Vox loop examined by an automated process flagged my quarters for an inspection. The absence of a recorded confession on a scheduled ledger triggered a pilgrim of minor inquiries. Even the drums of the manufactorum timed their pauses to the liturgy, and the length of the pause was a measurement. I found myself timing my breaths to machinery, counting in degrees the micro-pauses between liturgical lines. The body that was once mine became a device to be calibrated. Conversations that once comforted now contained questions that were not questions. The black market mechanic who used to repair my field pack would ask, over a wrench and the hiss of coolant, about the cadence of the worship service on your sector. The tone of voice was casual, but the implication sharp as a file. The language of inquiry had become corporate, procedural, composed, dispassionate. Men who had survived many campaigns by grit and blade became auditors. They have learned that cruelty wears the robe of civility. It is easier to cross a man off a ledger than to hurl him into the light. The priests adapted their rites accordingly. Benedictions included liturgical clauses designed to flush absence, a phrase to be repeated at the exact same pulse, a call and response that left no room for private replay. Choruses were posted on hymn cards and distributed to the habs so that the pattern of response could be compared against Vox logs. It was an artful cruelty. You were not corrected for lack of piety but for divergence from the authorized rhythm. The doctrine thus became instrumented. Even the language changed. Terms floated down from the enclave, crisp and administrative. Associational variants, synchrony compliance, liturgical fidelity. You could hear such phrases in the officers' mess as if they were discussing machinery. I remember a foreman say once, over a tin of warm stew, that deviation was a risk multiplier. That was the moment I realized the logic had left theology and entered systems analysis. Men like him did not want my soul. They wanted an assurance that my presence would not ripple into chaos. Isolation followed as a consequence. Comrades who once shared jokes at the latrine now offered only the thin exchange of civilities. Where there had been touch, hands on shoulders, the quick, necessary steadiness in a firefight, there was now a preferred distance. My gestures were watched and measured for contagion. Even affection became a variable to be minimized. Children learned their liturgies with the precision of copying machines. Tutors enforced exact syllabic timing, and anyone who failed received a visit from an instructor who kept a neat ledger. I took to moving through the habs like a man in a suit of fragile glass. Each step had to be measured for sound, for timing, for visible breath. I avoided windows where servoskulls liked to loiter. I kept my hands so that they were always visible in public, for closed fists invite suspicion. I practiced a blandness of expression, neutral as a cog, hoping that the performance of normalcy would perform me back into the fold. But the machinery is not only external, it found lodging inside me. I felt my thoughts traffic in ledger terms. I rehearsed speeches I had once spat in anger and now mouthed as a defense. I timed my prayers like a metronome. I began to store small lies as contingency phrases, ready to deploy in the event a casual, precise question came like a probe. To live under such continuous indexing is to feel your interior reduced to a file of plausible deniability. It was during one of those rehearsals that I was driven to confession, a ritual I had always believed to be a refuge. I took my place in the alcove because shame is a heavy thing and silence is too loud to endure alone. The chapel's light was dim, filtered through soot-dark glass, the votive flames guttering with patient breath. I spoke slowly at first, because speech in that room is counted. My voice faltered in the hymn, I admitted, the words a small stone I cast into the shallow pool of the priest's listening. I expected absolution, perhaps a penance. I expected the small grace of being made not unique in failing. Instead, a scribe's nib paused. There are small sounds that signpost a change in the world. The scratch of a quill is one of them. In the dim, I saw a hand lift, pen hovering, the little sound like the inhalation before a verdict. "Repeat those words again," he whispered. The pen trembled in the air between us, and in that tremor I understood the purpose of confession in this place. Not absolution, but amplification. I thought survival would be a clean thing, a private arithmetic of breath counted against bullets. I thought that if I kept my head down and answered the litany correctly, the machinery that judged would lose interest. I was naive. The truth is an economy not of coin but of people. One life balances another. One breath buys another man's silence. At first the vanishings were awkward and bureaucratic. A name absent from the muster sheet. A bunk empty at dawn with only a faint impression of sleep. A man transferred to essential maintenance in the lower holds where the lights do not reach. His locker cleared, his rations rerouted. No trumpets sounded. No one asked. We ate in the practiced silence of those who know the cost of curiosity. Removal takes gradations. The lowest grade is exile to refinery pits, lungs working until they fail. Higher is reassignment to penal cohorts fed into attrition. The worst blooms in a file. A trial entered in the dead of night, an adjudication so swift that family protest cannot find purchase. Paper kills here, sometimes with the theater of tribunals, sometimes by the softer violence of numbers and seals. My hesitation did not belong to me alone. It became an index, a contagion in the calculus of men who calculate compliance. Friends who had shared the latrine and bled at my side were suddenly footnotes in an administrative cascade. A comrade called for re-examination. A mother received counsel to adjust associations. An apprentice's training slot evaporated. Each erasure was a clean legal motion. Forms stamped, directives sent, lives rerouted. I remember Corporal Dax. He had a habit of knotting his scarf twice before the line. The rollkeeper dipped stylus, and where Dax's mark should have been there was a notation, transferred administrative. No one mentioned him aloud. Later I heard where they'd sent him. The pits, they said. Sometimes transferred means you are given work that no man returns from unmarked. It is not only ledger work. Sometimes bodies are taken at night and left at the perimeter without fanfare. Sometimes names are reassigned so a missing man becomes someone else on paper. I learned that the state can remap identity. A body will be reported as the one who failed, and the real person becomes a ghost whose grief finds only signatures and stamps as explanation. Guilt ossified quickly. Each evening I mapped changes: a cousin missing from the hymn, a foreman absent from the shift huddle, an extra ledger note stamped by the enclave. I traced the root of my hesitation and followed it to the openings it made in other lives. The arithmetic was simple and monstrous. My breath held, another family's ration pinched. My choice to live translated into another man's reassignment. I tried small amends, the only gestures available to a man under scrutiny. I left extra portions at the widow's door, carried warm water to a coughing child, spoke careful phrases in the chapel's shadow. Kindness itself calcified into suspicious association. The ledger read generous acts as links. Generosity became evidence of association with suspect elements. There are incentives to inform. A neighbor can gain favor by noting the odd cadence of a prayer. A line foreman rises by logging deviation. The architecture rewards those who record others. It does not need fanatics. It needs frightened men who prefer to be arbiters by ink rather than victims by silence. Fear sharpens compliance into ledger cruelty, ink as blade. Sometimes the disappearances are gradual, a sickness that moves through the squad. A man grows thin, his absence is reconciled as redeployment. His wife gets a packet and guidance. Later, a plaque appears and we say a measured prayer. The date bears no relation to the night he vanished. The state performs grief so that the community learns how to mourn on cue. I have watched mothers fold grief into ration tokens, hands that no longer tremble because trembling invites attention. I have seen mentors reduced to clerks, their jokes gone, their eyes cataloging risk. The small murders are quiet, removal of role, the erosion of someone's purpose until they exist only in a line on a file. The ledger's reach extended into the small arithmetic of daily life. Ration allotments shifted. My bunk assignments were altered. Watch patterns changed, so I slept under different men who looked at me as if I were an experiment. Friendships thinned into expedient nods. Conversation returned like a careful calibration, not to comfort, but to confirm. There were nights I rehearsed apologies like prayers. I counted the seconds between hymns, timed my salutes, practiced the cadence of the pledge until my mouth remembered obedience better than my heart. Survival became a performance under constant audit. Each successful hour felt like a debt owed to unseen accountants. I dreamed of the footsteps that would come to finally remove me. They were not the swaggering boots of executioners, but the steady tread of administrative men with clipboards and seals, people who could arrange ends with the serenity of clerks closing ledgers. In sleep, they weighed choices with calm efficiency. Who is critical? Who is expendable? Which households can absorb a loss? I woke with my throat raw and counted out the names I had once called friend. Then one night, when the moon was a razor across the refinery glow, I woke to sounds that were not the usual shuffle. Boots scraped heavier, a deliberate drag that spoke of cloth against stone and weight against metal. Someone had sealed the corridor. The bolt of my door was meaningless. The noise moved along the corridor and then stopped. They dragged a body past my unit. The scrape of the load made the hair rise on my arms. I pressed my palms to my thin blanket and listened. Men in low voices spoke in methodical tones, part of an accounting ritual. Check, confirm, move. Then one voice, close and slow, called a name. He said my name. It landed in the corridor like an indictment, precise, deliberate. For a wild moment, I wanted to scream through the door and tell them I was breathing, that I had not been taken, that someone had made a mistake. But the house rules are cruel. Shouting invites attention and attention eats you. The dragging resumed and faded into the hum of the refinery. The bolt did not shift. I lay awake, counting my breaths as if making a ledger entry. Inhale 1, exhale 2. My name had been spoken in the night, applied to a body that was not me, and in that act the calculus of survival revealed its final cruelty. The sound of the drag left a ring in my skull that has not faded. In the days that followed, I watched the block like a man watching a wound. The chapel filled with hymns whose words I knew by heart, but the music no longer washed the mind. It signaled a ledger update. People crossed themselves, kissed the talisman soldered to their collars, and walked away with the measured gait of the frightened. A child's question, "Why did they take him?" was answered with a phrase meant to soothe, "For the good of the many." It was a lesson. It was a law that teaches appetite for order. Guilt turned every small kindness I offered into a calculation. If I left my portion at a widow's door, would that action be logged as a helpful association or as evidence to be filed? When I shared a ration bar with a boy whose mittens had holes, I imagined a clerk jotting the moment into a column. Associational contact noted. The notches of my conscience multiplied. I became skilled at hiding warmth, at rationing compassion in the same way the commissars ration mercy. They had said my name. They had perhaps misattributed a body. They had perhaps staged a removal to silence those who might speak it. Or they had demonstrated that my life was a variable to be traded. Whatever the method, the meaning was the same. My life could be written and rewritten as easily as a record. I am still here, and that is no comfort. It is a heavier sentence than any bolt round. I am still breathing. They did not bring me in with chains. There was no need. The corridor that led to the chamber was a mouth of muted mosaics and soft carpet designed to eat footsteps. My escort, 2 men in plain gray, faces like the underside of a cloud, walked with me through it as if we were going on an errand. They did not speak. Their silence was not kind. It was the hush of something calibrated to make you hear yourself in ways you had not expected. The door at the end of the hall was a flat circle of iron, its rim polished by hands that had never meant to caress. When it opened, warm scented air spilled out, incense sweet and medicinal, a smell that made your throat remember confession before your mouth could. The chamber was smaller than I had imagined, a room folded inward to concentrate attention. The lamp over the table burned clear and cold, a pool of light that left the walls in deep private shadow. Shelves lined the far wall, books, clipped files, and glass jars containing things I could not name at first. Tiny relics, a child's cracked toy, a saddle strap, a length of braided wire, each set under glass as if preserved for study. A servoskull hovered near the ceiling with the petulant whir of a sleeping thing. Its red eye opened and closed like an intermittent pulse. He sat behind the table, hands folded around a cup that sent up a thin thread of steam. His robes drank the light. His smile was the kind that made cats uneasy. He wore no armor. He had no visible weapon. He had instead a clean quill and an inkpot the color of dried blood, both placed with deliberate care in front of him. When I entered, he inclined his head as if greeting a neighbor. "Sit," he said. The chair looked like any other, but when I settled it took my weight as if to count it. The wood creaked in punctual sympathy with the hushed ticking of a clock mounted behind the interrogator. There was a device on the table, a slim strip of brass with a small aperture that blinked, blue and soft. I thought at first it was a recorder. Later, I learned it measured micro-tremors in the voice, registered the tremble of confession, and turned it into evidence. He smelled of incense and old paper. Up close, the scent acquired definition. Cardamom, ash, a faint copper tang that made me think of a hospital's basin. His fingers were long, and when he tapped the quill against the lip of the ink pot, it sounded like a metronome. "Tell me," he said, his voice small and smooth, "about the moment you did not move." It surprised me that he did not begin with accusations. That would have been honest cruelty. At least an accusation admits itself. Instead, he asked for memory, invited me to bring the past into the room like a specimen to be examined. I told him what I remembered: the sound of the officer's command, the flash and hiss of La's fire, the way men vaulted the parapet and turned into arcs of light, and then nothing. I tried to name faces without meaning. I tried to explain that it felt as if my feet had been nailed to the ground by something heavier than fear. He listened, not with emphatic nods but with an impartial stillness. When I stopped speaking, he made a small noise and folded his hands. The servoskull drifted closer, and its clockwork eye recorded the pattern of my breath. He uncorked a small bottle and let a drop fall onto a plate. Its scent shifted the air in a way that sharpened memory, made the texture of images more exact. "Describe the man who fell directly in front of you," he asked. I named him. I told the interrogator about Dax's laugh and his double knot, about the way the man had hummed when he worked because it steadied his hands. I watched the interrogator as I spoke. He made no note until I finished. Then he wrote one single line. The quill's scratch was quiet in the room, but what it put down seemed heavier than the paper. What if he had not fallen? He asked, as if pondering a riddle. What if he had stepped back, stayed the trench, refused the charge as you did? The question was surgical. It cleaved the remembered world in two and left me with one half that I had not owned. The possibility that others might have followed my non-motion, that my refusal could be imitated, that my breath might teach others a new economy. He did not ask me whether I had been right. He asked whether my survival had consequences beyond my ribs. He did not ask, in the blunt language of tribunals, whether I had disobeyed. He asked what my continued existence taught those around me. There is a certain terror in being reframed. To be accused is to be active, to be judged for a deed. To be asked why you live is to be passive and therefore monstrous by omission. His questions were not attempts to find truth. They were attempts to shape me into confession. He gestured to the shelves, and I noticed then the slow, deliberate cataloging of the room. Each jar, he said calmly, held examples of contagion, words preserved, gestures archived, echoes of doubt studied like malformations. The preservation made the idea of confession tactile. It was not mercy that cleaved them, but preservation for inspection. He introduced tapes, vox rolls, one after another. They had the grainy rasp of battlefield transmission, orders repeated, prayers compressed, a voice the kindling of faith. He played a moment back for me, my own voice timid, swallowed by the mic but traceable, a small notch in the hymn when I faltered. Hearing it was unbearable because it made the memory public inside the room where publicness matters. He fed the tape slower and slower till every syllable became a thread, and he pointed gently to parts where my breath had caught. "You hear that?" he said. "That breath is evidence." He was patient. He had a remarkable patience. He let me tell the story until I could no longer remember which parts were memory and which parts his gentle prompting had drawn out. He asked me to imagine truth in a ledger-like way. If every hesitation becomes a notation, who reads the notations and what do they do with them? He spoke of systems and propagation, of morale and pattern. But when he spoke of systems, his voice had no heat. It was calculation shaped into syllables. There were moments when his demeanor felt almost kindly. He offered me water and set it down with two hands, the motion ritualized. He told me a story of a man who had confessed and then been allowed to work in the enclave as a clerk. His voice suggested that confession might preserve life if shaped correctly. "We prefer to salvage," he said. "We prefer men to labor under observation." The offer felt like a trap because to be salvaged, I realized, required a particular language of self-loathing. To say plainly that you should have died, that your breath is a trespass, that your heart is unfit for the shrine. He brought out a map and laid tiny tokens upon it, names arranged like chess pieces. He asked me to move a token and name who would be sacrificed for the rest to live. He called it hypotheticals. I called it the mechanics of confession. Each small tilt of his hand revealed what the system needed. Not a body, but the admission that one was unworthy. To confess that you should have died is to legitimize the order. To live but proclaim yourself unfit for life is to restore balance without bloodshed. At one point he leaned forward and fixed me with a look that took the warmth from the room. "Do you think," he asked, "that the Emperor values breathing less than obedience?" He did not wait for an answer. He did not need it. His question hung like a bell that rings to focus the congregation. He spoke then of example, of narrative. "If a man says to his child, 'I live by my own measure,' the child learns to think," he murmured. The sentence folded inward, revealing its design. Thought, I realized, was the true offense. I tried to speak of reasons, of the flickering, small things that had not burned away. A sister's laugh, a baker's care with bread, the odd pattern of stars above the manufactorum when shells had not yet turned the night to ash. I tried to explain that my refusal was not a political act but a human one threaded with fear and the vague, terrible desire to breathe. His smile did not change. He wrote more lines. "There is a ritual of diminishing in that room. The interrogator breaks you down not with flame but with the softness of patience. He asks until you begin to ask of yourself. He rewrites your life in tentative phrases, then shows you the writing with a clarity you did not possess before." When the quill touched paper, each stroke felt as if it had weight. Words moved from being ephemeral to becoming frames around my life. Toward the end, he closed the file and pushed it across the table. "We have a record now," he said. He watched as my eyes tracked the thin pile of pages. "Records do not require immediate action. Records merely exist. They wait." I thought in that moment that perhaps he would send me back to some quiet duty, that my life, cheap and persistent, would be allowed to continue under the same dark, watchful sky. Perhaps confession would be a mechanism of reintegration. Perhaps mercy had been disguised as inquiry. Then his smile cut like a thread. "Do you know what confession truly is?" he asked softly. I opened my mouth to answer and clutched at words that scuttled away. He put the quill down as if to punctuate the question. He reached instead for the brass strip on the table. The little aperture glowed, and the servoskull recorded the small sound of his breath. He leaned toward me, and for the first time his eyes sharpened with something like hunger. "Your survival," he said, and his voice had the slow, inevitable cadence of a bell, "is your confession." The blue light in the brass winked once, and the chamber felt like an audience. They led me down into the belly where living things were kept like evidence. The holding hall smelled of boiled stew and disinfectant, a sourness that stuck to the back of the throat. Overhead, strip lamps hummed with a steady, electrical patience and threw the room into long, harsh bands of light. The floor was gritted metal, the kind that leaves a memory in the soles of your boots. Under it, the hospital ducts sighed, and the distant mechanical heart of the facility pumped on and on. This place had once been a storeroom for machine parts. Now it was a waiting room for judgment. They sent me between rows of benches bolted to the floor. Men and women sat huddled upon them, shoulders curved inward as if to make themselves smaller. Their clothes were ragged in different ways, some with singe marks and patched sleeves, others as neat as if someone had tried to keep appearance as defense. Faces bore the language of different defeats. One had a jagged scar that spidered across his cheek. Another's eyes were glassed with sleep that had never been deep. A child, no more than 10, fingered a cloth puppet until his knuckles blanched. They were not all the kind of men the propaganda pictures show. There were no resplendent heroes among them. Only ordinary people with worn hands and names that had been dampened into numbers. Some kept chanting the sanctioned phrases until the words ran dry and sounded like an old gear grinding. Others muttered histories of small kindnesses, as if reciting evidence that they had once been human. A few sat utterly unmoving, eyes fixed on an inner point where the light could not reach, as if preserving a private flame against the draft of interrogation. I found a place at the far end and sat. Around me, a chorus of small sounds made up the atmosphere: the rasp of breathing, a cup set down too hard, the scrape of a blanket folded back and smoothed with an absent mind. The clinking of a chain-link pan that held stamped tags was like the ticking of a watch, regular, indifferent. It is strange how quickly a body learns to adapt to containment. After a few hours, my knees remembered the exact angle of the bench. My eyes learned to avoid the direct, hungry lighting. My hands found a slow, careful way of clasping together so as not to draw attention. You become practiced in the physics of being small. You move in ways that make it easier for those who pass to misread you as harmless. The first night in that hall, I watched men perform their survival. One lifted his voice in a long, loud assertion of loyalty, a theatrical thing, a flag planted to distract and protect. He called the emperor's name like a bell, and people around him nodded as if marking time. There is power in the shouted phrase. It situates you within the chorus and may, for a moment, make you invisible to auditors who prefer clear harmonies. Another among us, a woman with a jaw like split iron, banged her cup on the bench and shouted the names of those who had stood with her in the trenches. She did it to keep fear from making her small. The sound knitted an instant of courage, and it was terrifying and beautiful because it was an attempt to reclaim a fate by force. Others did not shout. They sobbed quietly, their cries swallowed by the room's hum. They wept for children left behind, for partners dragged away in the night, for the absurd arithmetic that made one man's breath cost another man a job. I watched the faces between the sobs and saw how grief had different signatures. Some were sharp as a cut, others long as an infection. They paid their grief carefully, like currency, so as not to attract further interest. There were men who told stories, small elegies really, an account of a day in which a comrade had split his ration so a mother might feed 2 children, or how someone had held the line until the supply convoy came. These stories had nothing to do with glory. They were inventories of the small human exchanges that had once held communities together. Each tale had the strange function of both proof and plea. Proof that such soft acts had happened, plea that someone remember them as more than errors. In the telling, a shared humanity flickered for a moment. But among these human traces there was also a clear pattern, the same small acts of hesitation, the same quiet breaths that had differed from the sanctioned rhythm. A man near me, his hands were thin, his beard only just stubbled, kept repeating the same sequence when he spoke, as if practicing a confession he would not yet make. He said, I paused. I held my weapon. I did not step when ordered, and every time he said it he looked straight at the place behind my ear, as if wondering whether my presence had infected him. That word infected the air, hesitation. It spread not by command but by proximity. To describe the moment you did not move is to hand someone a model for what non-motion looks like. To name it is to anchor it in the mind. Stories are contagious in this way. A hesitation becomes an idea, and an idea, once conceived in the lungs of another, will sometimes grow teeth. I listened to them and found in their voices the echo of my own. Their hesitations were not heroic acts of conscience. They were accidental, human, a miscounted breath, a memory of a sister's laugh, a worry about children awaiting rations. The horror is not that they refused as a group. The horror is that my single, private breathing had become a pattern others could learn to repeat. My existence had, in ways I had never anticipated, signaled a possibility. Gradually, the numbness set in. It is not the dramatic numbness of romance novels or song. It is an arithmetic dulling. When you sit in a room where grief is administrated, your feelings become small, efficient tools. You no longer feel outrage as a surge, but as a forecast you consult with your hands folded. You ration pity because gratitude can be audited. The pressure to direct your emotions into acceptable channels changes what those emotions are. In the dead hours between shifts, I watched men attempt to keep their edges. A detainee would roll a cigarette with fingers that trembled, then hand it to another with eyes that asked nothing and gave nothing. We learned to hide the way care deferred to necessity. A small cloth tucked inside a boot for later, a ration wrapped and passed through a fist, a whispered list of names to remember. There was a grim solidarity in these furtive gestures, a quiet pact to remember one another as more than files. But solidarity itself can be dangerous. Even a whispered list will be catalogued if overheard. Compassion becomes data. I saw that happen. A man who had given a ration to a neighbor found that his name was marked on a slate by a clerk whose expression was an economy of business decisions. The clerk's act was not cruelty so much as procedure. He did not hate them. He was a man performing a solution, and in the system there is always a solution that makes an example. That realization chewed away at something in me. I wished for the simplicity of a single verdict, the bluntness of a public sentence, if only because clarity would be a mercy. Instead, the punishment came in bureaucratic increments, transfers, watch changes, quiet warnings, and each small shunt rearranged another life. The cumulative pressure was more exhausting than a blade. It is one thing to be condemned by rote. It is another to be eroded by routine. We were not all guilty of the same thing. Some were here for utterances turned into evidence, some for failing to fall in line when ordered, others for acts of kindness misread as conspiracy. The categories blurred. The room's architecture turned to names and then to numbers. The human particulars were smoothed away. Still, when you look someone in the face long enough, the categories peter out, and what remains is a person who had loved bread and a sky and something small that made them lift their head in the morning. It was in that haze that I felt the reflection most sharply. Wherever I turned, I saw my own hesitation mirrored, in the set of a jaw, in the way someone avoided the light, in the private prayer said with the lips moving but the mind absent. Sometimes I imagined my breath as a small contagion, invisible and airborne, a thing that passed in coughs and shared cups and the space between words. That thought was a pestilence of guilt. At the edge of the row, a man with eyes like worn coins leaned toward me. He had been quiet all evening, his body a damp outline against the bench. When he spoke, his voice was thinner than I expected, as if the sound itself had been rationed. "I never wanted to die either," he whispered. The words were nothing like a confession or a plea. They were simpler and infinitely more terrible, an admission of the basic fact that none of us had asked for the ledger that ordered our ends. They carried no indictment and yet contained it all. His breath touched my shoulder as he spoke, small and warm and utterly human. I looked at him, at the threadbare collar of his tunic, the hope hollow of his eyes, and understood that the question I had first asked in a chapel years ago had not been mine alone. It had become a shared calculus, an ember passed hand to hand in the dark. At that moment, the room tilted in a new way. The solidarity I had felt as a survival trick shifted into something else, a recognition so raw that it made my throat ache. We were a congregation not of doctrine, but of the lived knowledge that no one among us had volunteered for this exchange, to give breath for an emblem to be measured and then expended. Outside, somewhere above the grating and the hum, the city continued. Drums paced the hours and a distant bell matched them with a mechanical grace. Inside the hall, our breathing synchronized, not to any hymn but to one another. In the thin space between that man's whisper and my next inhale, I knew the contagion had become conscious. The thought spread faster than the clerks could file it. They dressed the square as if to celebrate something holy. Platforms rose in concentric rings like the ribs of a great, dying beast. Iron scaffolds, scarred with old welds and stamped with factory sigils, had been repurposed into viewing stages. Where once cranes had swung slag, men now stood with banners and hymn cards. 100 braziers were set in careful geometry, each one fed with resin-dressed wood and ragged lengths of oilcloth. The light did not so much fall as press, a low, amber pressure that made shadows run hard and thin across faces. Above it all, the sky was the flat, inverted bowl of a manufactory, shot through with the little sparks of distant furnaces like distant, indifferent stars. They placed us, those marked for the pyre, on a low cart at the center. The cart was a polished thing of iron and old varnish, its wheels shod with silent tread. I walked onto it as if stepping into a stage direction. The ropes that bound the condemned were not cruel, more ornamental than necessary, braided cords burnt at the ends to suggest sanction. They tied my wrists with practiced hands and the knot was careful, almost affectionate in its steadiness. No one bothered to shout. The crowd itself performed the noise, the low drone of collective breath, the scrape of sandals, the metallic whisper of coins changing pockets. The priests mounted the dais with the soft certainty of ritual. Their vestments gleamed with a wet sheen from some preservative oil, and from a distance the gold thread looked like a promise. Their voices rose not in fury but in instruction, one measured cadence stacked atop another until the sermon became architecture. They taught in metaphors that the crowd could taste: rot in the fruit, a wound left to fester, a corruption that must be excised so the body might heal. Fire was named mercy, removal was called sacrament. They lit the first pyre with a slow and ceremonious economy. A flamethrower, its nozzle ornate as an ecclesiastical scepter, hissed hot and deliberate, a serpent of blue that licked the prepared fuel and then gave over to a white gold glow. The smell, sharp, oily, almost sweet, rose and clung to my throat like syrup. It layered itself over the scent of incense until the air was a complex medicine: camphor and cedar, promethium and singed hair. Smoke wound up in a thick column, black and cholesterol-rich, and carried voices with it so that chants from 2 streets over arrived at our ears like replies in a litany. Watching fire up close is different from imagining it in a barrack's tale. On the cart, heat behaves as a physical force. It pushes at your skin. It makes the tiny hairs along your arms tense like antennae. It draws water from your lips until words feel like brittle sticks. Flames are not tidy. They curve and snap. They find the tiny weaknesses in cord and cloth, the threads that will light easiest. Nearby, a man whose face I had once known to grin at a joke now had his jaw set in a thin horizontal line. The flame leapt and took at the fringe of his tunic. A bright flare kissed his shoulder and he did not blink. It is possible to be both alive and already a memory. Some condemned scream. The sound is animal and terrible, a friction of voice that tears at the air. The scream is not always for mercy. Sometimes it is astonishment, the instant comprehension that one's body is answering to a new set of rules that does not include the self. Other times a condemned man will be completely still, as if the nerves themselves have chosen to disconnect rather than carry pain. I watched a woman with her hair shorn close stand with eyes wide and mouth closed. The line of her throat tightened like a drawn wire. She seemed to be listening to some private accounting far beneath the flame. Between the pyres, the crowd moved in choreographed ways. Heads inclined, hands crossed, eyes honing in on the spectacle like lenses focusing on truth. Mothers shielded children's faces with practiced motions, yet their hands were steady. The training of a generation makes for careful gestures. Faces in the crowd told a strange story. Some were flushed with righteous heat, others slack as if the event were an obligation performed for the benefit of memory rather than belief. Here and there, a face betrayed hesitation. An old man with tremulous fingers who looked not at the sacrament but at the man beside him, as if checking whether the story they had been told still fit the life he would return to. I thought, foolishly at first, that the flames would erase the thought, that the consuming would be absolute, a performance so complete the idea would be charred out of the world. But watching the fire taught me a different cruelty. The flame takes the body. It cannot seize the idea lodged between ribs. Ideas are not flammable in the same shapes as flesh. The act of incineration gilds the thought and scatters it in smoke. The smoke carries shape. It is a messenger. Those who breathe it do not merely watch. They inhale the residue of the moment. Watching a man burn gives you an idea of ruin that is more precise than before. There is also the spectacle's strange alchemy, grief transposed into ordinance. A death made public becomes dramatized into instruction. The pyre folds terror into doctrine. Men chant and then forget they have watched an end. They remember that they have performed civic devotion. It is a cleansing that works on the surface only. Heat sears skin, and the crowd leaves with the sense they have participated in a necessity. But the thought the pyre was meant to evacuate migrates into the watchers. They go home with ash in the corners of their mouths and a small, sharp thing lodged behind their ribs, the possibility that the cost of order is paid in increments by people they love. I have seen the aftermath 1,000 small ways. The widows who folded their hands at the wall months later spoke with the tonality of memorized grief. Children learn the obsequies as litany. The state reprints sermons that use the pyre as pedagogy. The registrars add new columns to their forms: cause public, disaffection stamped, re-education recommended. The machinery of order records the spectacle and converts it into policy. It is thus efficient and therefore, in its own terms, merciful. But the mechanics do not account for the fact that ideas are migratory. They ride the smoke, settle in throats, hide among the half-formed thoughts of those who might otherwise have continued living by rote. A man leaves the square and stands awkwardly at his kitchen grate. He does not preach dissent, yet the ember of a question will glow in him at odd times. While mending a boot, while noticing that a child is not at school, while tasting bread and measuring whether it is sufficient. The memory of a man's face in flame is not instruction, it is seed. There was a moment, as the last piles of wood darkened to coal, when the priests lowered the torches and the brazier's tongues sighed and thinned. The crowd's noise softened. The last ceremonials were given in small, measured decrees. A hush fell that was less holy than waiting. The square contracted into itself. I felt, with the small, private vertigo of a man who has watched too closely, that the event had completed its broadcast. People would fold their hymn cards and return to the hum of refineries and ledger rooms. And then I heard a voice, not a shout, not a call to prayer, a voice scarcely louder than the scrape of a boot. It came from the fringe of the crowd, a woman's whisper, I think, or an adolescent whose throat had not yet found full hardness. The words were not meant to be heard. They were a stray thought that had found the courage to become sound. I did not wish to die for the Emperor. They were the same cadence I had used once, small and private, the confession I had thought buried. Hearing them spoken into the open did not strike like betrayal but like recognition. The whisper traveled like a current through the audience. I felt the movement as if it were a breeze across the coals. Heads tilted. A hand went to a rosary bead. A man at the back of the crowd swallowed and then made the ritual noise of assent. In that thin instant, everything unspooled. The pyre had not cleaned. It had redistributed. The idea returned, no longer an accusation only lodged within me, but a thought carried by another throat given air. It was not triumphant. It was not even organized. It was merely a human confession repeated aloud, small and dangerous because it named a corrosive thing by its truth. The flames had done their work on the bodies. Their visible remnants were ash and coal and a sallow smoke that smeared the sky. But the private remnant, the question of refusal, the claim of self-preservation over sacrifice, had been set free into the crowd like a smoldering seed. It would find soil in hands that held hymn cards, in boys who learned the rhythm of worship, in women who made porridge at dawn. It would not stop with me. The torches were lowered. The priests intoned the final benediction. The crowd dispersed. People filed away by tens, then hundreds, their footsteps leaving patterns on the stone. I felt the shift of feet as the square drained. I thought then of the man whose mouth had shaped the words. I thought of the child who had heard it and might speak it tomorrow in a voice that will not understand consequence. I thought of how the state will set its gears to catch that whisper and make it a file. And still the whisper lingered. It hummed under the drone of refineries, tucked into pockets and prayers, a small, steady ember that refused to go out. Section VII, the price of a thought. They taught us how to measure sacrifice as if it were geometry, one life on this axis, another life on that, a balance drawn with the straightedge of law. It sounded tidy in doctrine rooms. In practice, it was a terrible arithmetic practiced on living bodies. I learned the sums by watching how a single hesitation reshaped whole households, by tracking how my breath bought other people's silence. The aftermath is quieter than any public spectacle. After a tribunal, the city will sing for a day and then resume its movements, but the slow economy of suspicion keeps working. Filings go into ledgers. Directives circulate like polite storms. Fathers are reassigned, mothers warned, children slipped into other schools for safety. The instruments of governance do not need blood at every step. A stamped form, a reassignment order, a sudden promotion to an exhausting watch will do just as well. I watched a neighbor change under that pressure. He had once whistled while mending a valve. His whistle became a careful, calculated sound. He marked his day in smaller units, when to eat, what to say, how long to pause after a sermon, until life itself felt like inventory. When his son's apprenticeship evaporated, his hands shook as he folded the small tools they had saved to buy. The ledger had taken a boy in exchange for my breath. The enclave does not erase wholesale. It designs pathways that make disappearance look administrative. Names are moved, records adjusted. A family does not always know whether a man is dead or simply declared inactive. Ambiguity becomes a method. The bureaucracy owns unpredictability. A body whose fate is vague cannot easily be mourned. An ambiguous grief is quieter and therefore less dangerous. The cycles of accusation are relentless because they feed incentive. Report a neighbor's odd cadence at prayer, and you are rewarded with a ration increase or safer duty. Small acts of self-preservation become mechanisms of control. Men learn to prefer petty complicity to the terror of standing apart. Guilt crystallized in me. Nights were spent balancing horrors like coins. My breath for a man's livelihood, my silence for a mother's quiet tears. I tried petty amends, leaving an extra ration outside a door, repairing a cracked helmet, but these gestures were bandages, not cures. The ledger treats kindness as evidence. Generosity becomes a link to be filed, not a salvation. The social fabric frays at its edges. Where once the town shared kettles and jokes, now people check lists before they speak. Smiles are rationed. Mutual aid becomes hazardous. The instinct to help is a liability. I remember a baker whose husband had vanished after a rumor that he had hesitated in a charge. Her shortbread smelled the same, but the warmth in her hands froze when she saw me on the lane. Her bakery window held the cracked toy he had carved. It stayed on the sill, a small testimony to a life redirected into paperwork. Children learn measurement early. They time prayers with the cadence of the Manufactorum and speak only when cued. This training converts shock into replication. It converts a question into an omission. The most efficient repression is the one that teaches itself to the young. At times, the mechanism's triviality cut deeper than the spectacle. A clerk with tender hands was reassigned after a neighbor logged that his hymn had been fractionally slow. He had carved a wooden toy for a child. His notation, liturgical variants, ran down the chain until the bench where he worked was empty. The child's toy lay cracked and forgotten on a sill. People adapted. One man told me he practiced his loyalty aloud each morning so an automated listener would have a clean file to reference. If the record is good, he said, they leave you alone. The system trains survival into ritual. You become preemptive in your own diminishing. I became both predator and prey in that ecology. I had thought staying alive might let me warn, protect, redistribute what small goods remained. But the ledger flattens nuance. Quiet subversions were cataloged into association lines and later used to justify other removals. Survival required compliance. Compliance supplied the system, it seems. I kept asking whether I was complicit simply for breathing. Some consequences were causation, others coincidence. The system preferred tidy narratives and drew lines where none might strictly exist. Innocence rarely mattered. A mother's grief, a man's service record, an earnest plea, none guaranteed safety against a notation that decided otherwise. I tried once to set the record straight. I went to a regional clerk and asked, quietly, if a note could be appended to clarify a transfer. He pushed his spectacles up and let his hands hover over the ledger like a man about to play chess with names. We cannot amend history for sentiment, he said. We only record patterns. His words were a bureaucratic mercy less brutal than fire for its quiet suffocation. The Imperium soundscape is never empty. Bells toll in measured chords. Furnaces hiss and gear teeth click. Cogitators spin their ledgers like insect wings. Beneath those noises is another sound, the silence of unburied things. It is the hush where bodies have been legally unmade or quietly moved, where a child's laugh has been filed into a line and flattened. That silence has weight. It presses against the ribs like a remembered hand that will not release. I imagine, sometimes, what would happen if 1,000 small hesitations happened at once across a city. The machinery would not collapse, it would adapt and harden. New boxes would be added, new checks written, and the system would continue. That is why dissent here is not a theatrical act but a slow corrosion, and why the most dangerous thing a man can do is to keep breathing without declaring himself an instrument of sacrifice. The true price is loss of imagination. To survive here is to trade questions for scripted answers, to smooth the edges of curiosity into the straight lines the ledger accepts. You fail little by little. The memory of a sister's laugh becomes shorthand. The shape of a child's face fades into a statistic. The taste of fresh bread is remembered only enough to recognize hunger. These losses accrue until the self is a ledger entry and the inner life a footnote. I remember the baker, her hands blunt from kneading, fingers nicked and patient. After her husband was moved, she arranged loaves as if ritual might hold him in place. Once I found the small wooden toy he had carved hidden in an oven's shadow. Later it lay cracked on a windowsill. That toy felt like an accusation, something meant for a life now redirected by files. A foreman I respected signed a transfer that sent a friend into the lower furnaces. He told me without triumph that someone must make compromises. His eyes were exhausted. The system does not need fanatics. It needs men willing to perform small violences so the machine keeps functioning. I kept lists, names folded into scraps and hidden in hems. At night I would press them to my chest and then burn them, because ash cannot be used as evidence. Burning is not heroic. It is a private refusal to let paperwork be the last witness. It is a small way to keep memory from being wholly digitized into a ledger. A clerk once told me plainly, "We record patterns. We cannot amend history for sentiment." He looked through me as if I were an inconvenient footnote. His answer was not spectacle. It was the ordinary denial that makes grief administrative. So the city counts and I count. They add columns to keep order. I keep names to keep humanity. The price of a thought is therefore paid in the quiet of other rooms, in children's interrupted breakfasts, in the slow narrowing of the heart's capacity to imagine another world. Tonight the bell will toll. The ledger will take its next line. I will fold this page into the seam of my robe and press it to my chest because the act of naming is all the defiance I have left. Then I will douse the lamp. The paper will curl and cool against my skin. My voice will fall quiet. The ledger will go on. Silence.